The bullet tore through Margaret's shoulder before she even heard the shot. She hit the concrete, hard blood spreading across her shirt, pain screaming through her 58-year-old body. 20 feet away, Viktor Dimitrov smiled as his men closed in. The legendary Margaret Chen, my father's killer, finally broken. Margaret's hand found her backup weapon, her vision blurring, but her mind crystal clear. She'd been underestimated her entire life. Too young, too female, too old. They always made the same mistake. "I'm not broken yet," she whispered and fired. Everything that led to this moment, the sneering instructors, the impossible rescue, the decades of invisible service, had prepared her for exactly this. They'd looked at the old lady with a gun and laughed. Now they'd learn what a fatal mistake that was. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end of this story. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Margaret's story travels. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The fluorescent lights of Miller's tactical range hummed overhead as Margaret Sullivan signed the waiver with steady hands. The 19-year-old behind the counter name tag reading Brad barely glanced at her driver's license before sliding it back across the counter. "Lane 6 is open, ma'am," he said, his tone dripping with the kind of patronizing courtesy reserved for customers he assumed didn't know the difference between a magazine and a clip. "That's our beginner section, nice and close to the targets. 25 feet should be about right for you." Margaret's expression didn't change. "I requested lane 12, the tactical course." Brad's eyebrows shot up. Behind him, two other instructors, both in their mid-20s, both with the overdeveloped arms and underdeveloped situational awareness that came from spending more time at the gym than the range, stopped their conversation to listen. "Ma'am," Brad said, his voice now carrying an edge of barely concealed amusement. "Lane 12 is for advanced shooters. It's a timed course with moving targets, stress positions, rapid transitions. Maybe you'd be more comfortable." "Lane 12, Margaret repeated. Her voice was quiet, calm, and absolutely unmovable. "I paid for lane 12. I'd like lane 12. The two instructors behind Brad weren't even trying to hide their grins now. The taller one, Jackson, according to his shirt, nudged his companion and stage whispered, "Think she's getting it for her grandson's birthday." "Nah," the other one replied, voice deliberately loud enough for Margaret to hear. "Probably saw it on one of those crime shows. Think she's gonna learn to protect herself from the mailman." They laughed. Brad at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, but he didn't tell them to shut up. Margaret set her range bag on the counter with a soft thud. "Lane 12, she said for the third time. "Or I can take my business to Precision Firearms down the highway. I hear their instructors are actually professionals." The smile vanished from Brad's face. He glanced at his manager's office, empty, and clearly made a calculation about whether arguing with a customer was worth the hassle. "Fine. Lane 12, but you'll need to demonstrate basic proficiency before we activate the full course. Insurance requirements." "Of course," Margaret said. She picked up her bag and walked toward the range entrance, her sensible walking shoes making no sound on the rubber floor mats. Behind her, she heard Jackson mutter, "This should be good. $10 says she can't even load the magazine." "20 says she drops it when it fires," the other instructor replied. Margaret kept walking. She'd heard variations of this conversation more times than she could count. 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 5 years ago before her husband died and she'd packed away her weapons for what she thought would be the last time. They always underestimated her, every single time. The range proper was divided into 18 lanes, progressively more complex as the numbers increased. Lanes 1 through 6 were standard paper targets at fixed distances. 7 through 11 added movement and obstacles. Lane 12, the one Margaret had requested, was a full tactical course pop-up targets. No-shoot civilians mixed with hostile threats, timed sequences that required rapid position changes and precise shot placement. It was a course designed for law enforcement and military personnel maintaining their qualifications. Margaret set her bag down at Lane 12's prep station, ignoring the curious looks from the handful of other shooters scattered across the range. Most were men in their 30s and 40s. The demographic that took tactical shooting seriously enough to practice, but not seriously enough to go professional. They glanced at her, registered the gray hair and reading glasses, and immediately dismissed her as someone's confused grandmother who'd wandered into the wrong section. She unzipped her bag with practiced efficiency. Inside, carefully wrapped in a soft case, was a Sig Sauer P226, the same model she'd carried 25 years ago, though not the same weapon. That one had been confiscated when she'd retired. This one she'd purchased 3 days ago after the phone call that had turned her world upside down. The phone call about James Morrison. Her hands moved through the familiar ritual of inspection, press check, magazine, well examination, sight, alignment, verification. Muscle memory from decades of training took over, and for a moment she wasn't a 58-year-old widow in a civilian range. She was Lieutenant Commander Margaret Chen, Navy SEAL, preparing for operations that didn't officially exist. "Ma'am?" Margaret looked up. Brad had followed her, clipboard in hand, his expression hovering somewhere between skepticism and concern. "I need to observe your qualification before activating the course. Just 15 rounds at 25 feet standard target. Show me you can handle the weapon safely." "Fine," Margaret said. She loaded 15 rounds into the magazine, chambered the first round, and assumed a modified Weaver stance that probably looked awkward to Brad's untrained eye weight, slightly back arms, not quite fully extended posture that suggested someone trying to remember half-forgotten training. It was all theater. Margaret knew exactly what she was doing. "Whenever you're ready," Brad said, his tone making it clear he expected this to be a disaster that would give his buddies something to laugh about for the rest of the week. Margaret exhaled slowly, found the zone of absolute calm that had kept her alive through operations in Somalia and Afghanistan and Iraq, and squeezed the trigger. The first shot hit dead center. So did the second. And the third. By the fifth shot, Brad had stopped looking at his clipboard and started actually watching. By the 10th shot, the other shooters in nearby lanes had paused their own practice to observe. By the 15th shot, all 15 rounds creating what looked like a single ragged hole in the target's center mass, the entire range had gone silent. Margaret safed her weapon, removed the magazine, locked the slide back, and set the pistol down. Then she turned to Brad and said in that same quiet, unmovable voice, "Was that proficient enough?" Brad's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. "Yes, you're cleared for the tactical course." "Thank you." Margaret began reloading her magazines, her movements efficient and unhurried. The other shooters were whispering now. She caught fragments of conversation. "Did you see that? Who is she? Military, maybe?" Jackson and his buddy had materialized at the entrance to the range proper, drawn by the sudden silence. They stared at Margaret's target, then at Margaret, then back at the target. "That's impossible," Jackson said finally. "Nobody shoots a group that tight at 25 feet with a pistol. Not without a rest. Not freehand." Margaret finished loading her fourth magazine and looked up at him. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone pleasant and completely devoid of inflection. "Did you want to inspect my target? Make sure I wasn't cheating somehow?" "I didn't say." "You implied it." Margaret's eyes locked onto his, and for just a moment Jackson got a glimpse of something that made him take an involuntary step backward. Something cold and absolute and utterly without mercy. "I qualified as an expert marksman 32 years ago. I've maintained that qualification through regular practice ever since. The fact that you assumed I couldn't load a magazine says more about your prejudices than it does about my abilities." She let that hang in the air for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to make her point, not long enough to seem like she was lecturing, then turned back to her equipment. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to run the tactical course, unless your insurance requires additional demonstrations." Brad shook his head mutely. "Excellent." Margaret picked up her loaded weapon, her spare magazines, and her hearing protection. "Activate the course, please." What happened over the next 90 seconds would become range legend, the kind of story that got told and retold and embellished, until it barely resembled reality, though. In this case, the reality needed no embellishment. The tactical course at Miller's Range was legitimately challenging. It involved engaging 12 targets from 4 different positions, including prone kneeling and standing behind barricades. Some targets were stationary, others popped up for only 2 seconds before disappearing. 3 no-shoot target civilians were mixed in among the threats, painted bright blue to distinguish them, but positioned to create ambiguity and stress. The course record was 42 seconds, set by a former Army Ranger who practiced there 3 times a week. Margaret cleared it in 38 seconds. She moved through the course like water flowing downhill, smooth, inevitable, responding instantly to each new target without apparent thought or hesitation. Her transitions between positions were economical, her shot placement precise. She engaged 2 targets while moving, dropped to prone behind a barricade to engage 3 more, rolled to her right to clear an obstacle, came up to kneeling position for the final sequence. When the last target disappeared and the buzzer sounded, Margaret safed her weapon, stood up, and calmly began gathering her spent brass casings. The range had gone completely silent again. Brad walked over to the control panel, checked the timer, checked it again, then looked at Margaret with something approaching awe. "Ma'am, you just beat the course record by 4 seconds. Margaret deposited the brass casings in the recycling bin. "It's a good course, well designed. Though the sight lines on position 3 are slightly obstructed, you might want to adjust that." "Who are you?" Jackson had found his voice again, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. Margaret considered the question. 5 days ago, she would have answered, "I'm a widow from Arlington. I used to work for the government. Now I volunteer at the library." 5 days ago, that had been true, but then the phone call had come. The call from Admiral Catherine Hayes, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Maggie, we need to talk about Hawk Morrison. It's bad." Margaret picked up her range bag. "I'm someone who used to be very good at her job," she told Jackson. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other preparations to make." She walked out of the range, leaving behind a room full of stunned shooters and 3 instructors who would spend the rest of the day trying to figure out what the hell they'd just witnessed. Outside in the parking lot, Margaret allowed herself exactly 10 seconds to lean against her car and shake. Not from the shooting that had been almost relaxing, like slipping into comfortable old shoes, but from what the shooting represented. She'd told herself she was done with this life. After David died, David, who'd put up with 20 years of classified absences and mysterious injuries and nightmares, she couldn't explain. She'd promised herself she was finally truly retired. She'd kept that promise for 3 years. She'd been a good widow, a present grandmother, a reliable library volunteer. She'd let her tactical skills rust just enough to feel human again. Then Admiral Hayes had called. Margaret unlocked her car, tossed the range bag in the passenger seat, and pulled out her phone. She had 3 missed calls, all from the same number. She called it back. "Maggie." Admiral Hayes answered on the first ring. "Tell me you're not actually doing this." "I qualified today," Margaret said. "Muscle memory is still there. I'll need a few more days to get back to full operational capacity, but Maggie, listen to me. You can't do this. You're 58 years old. You haven't been operational in 15 years. This isn't some practice range. This is a hostile compound in the middle of the Arizona desert with at least 12 armed combatants and God knows what kind of security measures. I'm aware. You could die. I'm aware of that too." Margaret started her car but didn't pull out of the parking lot. "Katie Hawk Morrison saved my life in Mogadishu. When everyone else on that mission was ready to leave me behind, when command had written me off as KIA, Hawk went back. Alone. He dragged me 6 miles through hostile territory with a broken leg and enemy patrols on every corner. 6 miles. And when we finally reached the extraction point, he made sure I got on that helicopter before him. That was 30 years ago. That doesn't make it less true." Margaret's voice went quiet. "He's alive, Katie. Your intelligence confirms he's alive. And you're telling me the Navy won't mount a rescue because it's politically complicated. Because acknowledging that mission would mean acknowledging that women were doing classified SEAL operations before the official policy changed. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You're willing to let a decorated Navy SEAL die in captivity because saving him might be embarrassing for the Pentagon's public relations." Margaret's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. "I can't live with that. I won't live with that." "So you're going to run a 1-woman rescue operation against a fortified compound held by a terrorist cell led by someone who wants you specifically. Viktor Dimitrov isn't playing games, Maggie. He wants revenge for his father. This is a trap. Of course it's a trap. And you're walking into it anyway. Yes. Margaret pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the storage facility where she'd stashed the rest of her equipment 3 years ago. But I'm not walking in blind, and I'm not walking in unprepared. I know it's a trap. Victor knows I know it's a trap. The question is, who's better at springing traps, a 40-year-old terrorist with a grudge or a woman who spent 20 years running operations he's only read about? Admiral Hayes was quiet for a long moment. I can't help you officially. I know. If this goes wrong, the Navy will deny any knowledge of your actions. I know that too. And if you somehow pull this off, there won't be any medals or commendations or public recognition. You'll still be the widow from Arlington who volunteers at the library. Katie, Margaret said gently, I stopped needing recognition 30 years ago. I need Hawk Morrison to come home alive. That's all. Another pause, then, Lieutenant Marcus Webb. Margaret's eyebrows rose. What about him? He's Hawk's godson. His father served with both of you on the Mogadishu operation. Webb is currently stationed at Little Creek SEAL Team 6. He's been asking questions about Hawk's disappearance, pushing for official action. Admiral Hayes's voice dropped even lower. If someone were to approach him unofficially, explain the situation, make it clear that no official help was coming, he might be inclined to take personal leave. Use that leave however he sees fit. It was the closest thing to approval Margaret was going to get. Thank you, Katie. Don't thank me. This conversation never happened. And Maggie, don't get killed. David would never forgive me. The line went dead. Margaret drove in silence for 10 minutes processing the conversation. Then she pulled over and made another call, this one to a number she hadn't dialed in 16 years. Arlington Central Library, this is Susan. Susan, it's Margaret Sullivan. I need to take a leave of absence. Family emergency. I'm not sure how long I'll be gone. Oh no, is everything all right? It will be, Margaret said, hoping that was true. I just need to take care of something that can't wait. After she hung up, Margaret sat in her car and allowed herself one moment of brutal honesty. Admiral Hayes was right, this was insane. She was 58 years old. Her knees ached in the morning. She needed reading glasses. She got winded climbing the stairs to her apartment. She was not the operator she'd been at 28, but she was smarter, more patient, better at reading situations and people. And she had something Viktor Dimitrov didn't have: nothing left to lose. David was gone. Her daughter Sarah was grown and independent. She'd lived a full life, done work that mattered, made a difference. If she died trying to save Hawk Morrison, she'd die doing something that mattered more than slowly fading away in a quiet apartment surrounded by memories. Margaret put the car back in drive and headed toward the storage facility. She had 72 hours to prepare, 72 hours to become operational again, 72 hours to remember everything that had kept her alive through missions that officially never happened, 72 hours to prove that the most dangerous thing in any room wasn't the youngest or strongest person. It was the one everyone underestimated. The storage facility smelled like dust and motor oil and forgotten memories. Margaret's unit was climate-controlled, necessary for preserving certain types of equipment, and located in the back corner away from the casual traffic of people storing holiday decorations and old furniture. She keyed in her access code and rolled up the metal door. Inside, covered with a tarp and locked in a reinforced trunk, was the equipment she'd accumulated over 20 years of classified operations. Equipment she'd been allowed to keep after retirement, with the understanding that it would remain secured and unused unless authorized. Well, she was authorizing herself now. The trunk opened with a combination that hadn't been used in 3 years, but remained burned into her memory. Inside, tactical gear, body armor, communications equipment, specialized weapons that definitely weren't available to civilians through normal channels. And underneath everything else, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a waterproof case, was her father's medal, Navy Cross, awarded posthumously after his death during a training exercise that wasn't actually a training exercise. Margaret had been 8 years old when the officers came to the door, 23 when she finally learned the truth about what had happened. Her father had died stopping a terrorist attack on a military transport, saved 300 soldiers. received a medal that got locked in a vault because the operation was classified. She'd followed in his footsteps, knowing she'd probably end up with the same fate: classified missions, classified valor, classified death. But she was still here, and Hawk Morrison was still alive somewhere in the Arizona desert, waiting for someone to come for him. Margaret began methodically checking each piece of equipment, testing batteries, examining seals, verifying functionality. Her body might be older, but her tactical mind was as sharp as ever. "Mom." Margaret spun, hand instinctively moving toward her weapon before she recognized the voice. Sarah stood in the doorway of the storage unit, arms crossed expression, hovering somewhere between confused and furious. Her daughter, 32 years old, electrical engineer, mother of two, practical and sensible, and absolutely not supposed to be here. "Sarah." Margaret forced her hand away from the weapon. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing." Sarah stepped into the unit, her eyes scanning the tactical equipment with growing alarm. "I called the library. They said you took emergency leave. I tried your apartment. You weren't there. I was worried, so I tracked your phone." She gestured at the equipment. "Mom, what the hell is all this?" Margaret closed her eyes. Of all the complications she'd anticipated, this wasn't one of them. "Sarah, you need to go home." "Not until you explain what's going on. Are you in some kind of trouble? Are you—" Sarah's eyes went wide as she spotted the body armor. "Are you planning to hurt someone?" "No, God, no." Margaret held up her hands. "Sarah, I promise you this is not what it looks like." "Then what is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my mother, my retired government administrator mother, has a storage unit full of military equipment that I'm pretty sure is illegal for civilians to own." Margaret made a decision. She'd kept this secret for 32 years, through David's illness and death, through Sarah's childhood and adolescence and adulthood. She'd been a good military spouse, a good mother, a good keeper of classified secrets. But Sarah deserved the truth, at least some of it. "Sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to an overturned crate. "This is going to take a while." Sarah sat wary, but listening. Margaret took a breath and said the words she'd never thought she'd say to her daughter. "I wasn't a government administrator. I was a Navy SEAL. One of the first women to serve in special operations back before the policy officially changed. Everything I did was classified. Everything I am was classified." Sarah's expression went through several rapid changes: disbelief, shock, anger, confusion, before finally settling on something that looked like grief. "You lied to me, my entire life. You lied." "Yes. Dad knew." "Yes. How could you—" Sarah stood up, pacing the small space. "All those times you were gone. All those business trips. All those conferences. You were— what, killing people?" "Sometimes." Margaret's voice was steady. "Mostly I was saving people. Hostage rescue, counterterrorism, humanitarian operations. I did a lot of good in the world, Sarah. But I also did things I can't talk about. Things I'll never be able to talk about. And now," Sarah gestured at the equipment. "What's this? You're 58 years old, Mom. You're supposed to be retired. You're supposed to be safe. A friend is in trouble. Someone I served with. Someone who saved my life." Margaret met her daughter's eyes. "The government won't help him. Politics, bureaucracy, the usual bullshit. He's going to die unless someone acts." "So you're going to act? Alone?" "Not quite alone, but mostly yes." Sarah laughed, a brittle sound with no humor in it. "This is insane. You realize this is insane, right? You're not 25 anymore. You're not even 45. You're going to get yourself killed playing soldier." "Maybe." Margaret started repacking the equipment she'd checked. "But I have to try. You didn't know your father's father, your grandfather Chen. He died when I was very young, serving his country. I inherited his sense of duty. That same duty brought me to the Navy, brought me to special operations, kept me alive through missions that should have killed me." She paused. "That duty is calling again. I can't ignore it. And if you die," Sarah's voice cracked, "if I lose you too, Dad's only been gone 3 years, Mom. I can't lose you too." Margaret crossed the space between them and pulled her daughter into a hug. "I don't plan on dying. I'm very good at not dying. It's one of my primary skills." "This isn't funny," I know. Margaret pulled back, holding Sarah's shoulders. But I need you to trust me. Trust that I know what I'm doing. Trust that I've survived situations much worse than this. Trust that I'm coming back. Sarah wiped her eyes. Can I help? No. Mom, absolutely not. You have a family, you have children. You're not trained for this, and I won't put you in danger. Margaret's voice went firm. What you can do is go home. Take care of your kids, and if something goes wrong, make sure they know their grandmother loved them. Don't talk like that. Sarah, I need you to hear this. Margaret waited until her daughter was looking at her again. In that storage trunk underneath the tactical equipment, there's a sealed envelope. If I don't come back, that envelope contains everything you need to know. My real service record, commendations, operations I was part of, the truth about who I was and what I did. Mom, stop. There's also a letter for you, things I should have said years ago. Margaret's voice wavered for just a moment before she controlled it. I love you, Sarah. I'm proud of you. You turned out better than I had any right to expect given how much I was gone. That's your father's doing more than mine. He was the steady one, the constant one. Sarah was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. I don't want a letter. I want my mother. Then trust that you'll still have her in a few days. Margaret managed to smile. I didn't survive 20 years of classified operations just to get killed by some terrorist with a grudge. I'm too stubborn for that. Promise me. I promise I'll do everything in my power to come home. It was the only honest promise Margaret could make. They stood there for a long moment, mother and daughter separated by 3 decades of lies and reunited by 1 moment of truth. Finally, Sarah pulled away. I'm still furious with you. I know. When this is over, if you come back, we're going to have a long conversation about trust and honesty and all the therapy I'm going to need. Fair enough. Sarah headed for the door, then paused. What was he like? This friend who saved your life? Margaret smiled, a real smile this time. Hawk Morrison. He is the most stubborn, fearless, occasionally idiotic man I've ever served with. He once carried a wounded soldier for 8 miles through hostile territory, refused medical attention until everyone else was treated, then passed out from blood loss and broken ribs. When he woke up, the first thing he said was, "Did the kid make it? And you're going after him because you owe him." I'm going after him because he deserves to be saved. Because he's a good man who's done terrible things in service of his country and never asked for recognition or glory. Because he'd do the same for me. Margaret's voice went quiet. And because if I don't try, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have made a difference. Sarah nodded slowly. Okay. I don't understand. But okay. After her daughter left, Margaret finished her equipment check in silence. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed the number Admiral Hayes had given her. Lieutenant Marcus Webb answered on the 3rd ring. Hello. Lieutenant Webb, my name is Margaret Chen. I served with your father in Mogadishu. I need to talk to you about Hawk Morrison. Marcus Webb arrived at the coffee shop 20 minutes early, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about him. He sat facing the door back to the wall, choosing the tactical position instinctively. 29 years old, built lean rather than bulky, with the watchful eyes of someone who'd seen combat and survived by staying alert. Margaret slid into the seat across from him without preamble. You're early. So are you. Marcus studied her face clearly, trying to reconcile this gray-haired woman with the legendary operator his father had talked about. My dad said you were the toughest person he ever served with. Said you once kept fighting with a collapsed lung and 2 broken ribs. Your father exaggerates. My father doesn't exaggerate about combat. Marcus leaned forward. He also said you were declared KIA on that mission. Said Hawk Morrison went back alone to retrieve your body and found you still alive, barely. Said the 2 of you fought your way through 6 miles of hostile territory and made it to extraction with 30 seconds to spare. Your father has a good memory. He has nightmares about that mission. Still, 30 years later. Marcus's voice went hard. So when I got a call saying Margaret Chen wanted to meet about Hawk Morrison, I cleared my schedule real fast. Margaret appreciated the directness. No games, no posturing, just a man who understood the stakes. What has the Navy told you about Hawk's situation? Officially, that he's on an extended classified assignment and unavailable for contact. Marcus's jaw tightened. Unofficially, I know he was running surveillance on a terrorist cell in Arizona. I know he missed his extraction window 3 weeks ago. I know Command has made the decision not to mount a rescue because the political implications are too complicated. Wait, they told you that? They told me to stand down and stop asking questions. Marcus pulled out his phone, opened an encrypted message app, and showed Margaret a series of satellite images. But my fiancée works in intelligence analysis. She's not supposed to have access to these files. She accessed them anyway. The images showed a compound in the desert, exactly matching the location Admiral Hayes had described. Margaret zoomed in on one photo showing a building's thermal signature. Multiple heat signatures in the medical facility. At least 4. Could be more depending on how they're grouped. Marcus closed the phone. I've been running scenarios for 2 weeks. Every scenario ends the same way. I need more intel, more resources, and more personnel. This isn't a one-man operation. It's a 2-person operation. Margaret met his eyes. You and me. Marcus sat back, his expression flickering through disbelief, concern, and something that might have been offense. Ma'am, with all due respect. Don't. Margaret's voice went cold. Don't ma'am me, and don't with all due respect me. I know what you're thinking. I'm 58 years old. I'm past my prime. I'll be a liability in the field. I didn't say that. You were about to. Margaret pulled out her own phone and showed him a video. This was recorded yesterday at Miller's tactical range. Watch. The video showed her running the tactical course. Marcus watched in silence, his expression changing as the seconds ticked by. When it ended, he looked up at her with new calculation in his eyes. That's impressive. But a practice range isn't the same as a hostile compound with live enemies. You think I don't know that? Margaret's voice stayed level but gained an edge. Lieutenant Webb, I spent 20 years running operations in hostile territory. I've extracted hostages from fortified compounds in Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I've been shot at, blown up, and left for dead. I've killed men who were younger, stronger, and faster than me because I was smarter and more experienced. That was 15 years ago. Muscle memory doesn't forget. Tactical thinking doesn't age. Margaret leaned forward. You need me for this operation. Not because I'm the strongest or the fastest, but because I'm the only person Viktor Dimitrov wants more than he wants Hawk Morrison. I'm the one who killed his father. I'm the one he's been waiting for. That makes me the perfect asset for this mission. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. You're talking about using yourself as bait. I'm talking about using every advantage we have. Viktor expects me to come. He's counting on it. The entire compound is probably designed to funnel me into a trap. Margaret smiled without humor. But here's what he doesn't expect. I know it's a trap. And I'm walking in anyway with a SEAL Team 6 operator watching my back and exploiting every mistake Viktor makes while he's focused on me. That's assuming he makes mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes, especially when they're emotional. Margaret pulled up another file on her phone, this one a dossier on Viktor Dimitrov. His father was Nikolai Dimitrov, Soviet bioweapon scientist. We stopped him from deploying a nerve agent that would have killed thousands. I was the one who took the shot that killed him. Viktor was 19 years old, watching from a security feed. Marcus scrolled through the file. He spent 25 years building his own operation. Multiple terrorist cells across 3 continents. Weapons trafficking, drug smuggling, assassination contracts. This isn't some kid with a grudge, he's a sophisticated operator. Which is why we can't go in guns blazing. We need intelligence planning and patience. Margaret closed the file. I'm going whether you help me or not, but with you we might actually succeed. Without you, I'll probably die. Either way, I'm going. That's not a very compelling recruitment pitch. I'm not trying to compel you. I'm giving you the facts. Margaret's voice softened slightly. Your godfather is alive. He's being held by people who want to use him to get to me. The Navy has decided he's expendable, but we haven't. We have 72 hours before Victor's deadline expires. After that, he starts sending pieces of Hawk back to the Pentagon to prove he's serious about his demands. Marcus's face went rigid. They didn't tell me about the deadline. They wouldn't. Plausible deniability. Margaret signaled the waitress for coffee. Victor sent a video to Admiral Hayes 48 hours ago. It showed Hawk alive but injured. Broken ribs, possible internal bleeding. He needs medical attention soon, or he won't survive even if we extract him. You've seen the video. Admiral Hayes sent it to me, unofficially, along with the understanding that any action I take is completely unsanctioned and will be disavowed if I'm captured or killed. Jesus, Marcus rubbed his face. This is insane. We're talking about running an unauthorized rescue operation against a fortified compound with inadequate intel and zero support. Yes. If we fail, our careers are over. If we're captured, we'll be disavowed. If we die, it'll be ruled training accidents and our families will never know the truth. Yes. Margaret accepted her coffee from the waitress, took a sip, then said quietly, Your father told me once that the hardest part of special operations isn't the physical danger, it's the moral calculus. Knowing when the mission matters more than your career, your safety, or your life. He made that calculation in Mogadishu when he provided covering fire that allowed Hawk and me to reach extraction. He took 3 rounds making sure we got out. She met Marcus's eyes. He survived. But he was willing to die to save his teammates. That's the legacy he passed to you. Marcus stared at his coffee for 30 seconds. Then he said, I'll need 48 hours to gather equipment and develop an operational plan. You have 24. We deploy tomorrow night. That's not enough time. It has to be. Every hour we delay is another hour. Hawk is suffering. Another hour, Victor is fortifying his position. Another hour, the political situation gets more complicated. Margaret pulled out a handwritten list. I've already acquired most of the equipment we'll need. What I can't get through unofficial channels, you'll need to requisite through your Team 6 access. Marcus scanned the list, his eyebrows rising. Some of this is serious hardware. How did you... I still have contacts, people who owe me favors. Margaret didn't elaborate. Some secrets were better left unspoken. The question isn't whether we can get the equipment. It's whether you're willing to use it on an unsanctioned operation. I take personal leave starting tonight. What I do on my personal time is my business. Good answer. Margaret finished her coffee. Meet me at these coordinates tomorrow at 1800 hours. She slid a piece of paper across the table. Bring everything on that list. Wear civilian clothes. Tell no one where you're going. Marcus pocketed the paper. My fiancée knows something's happening. Can she be trusted? With my life. Then tell her enough to keep her from calling your commanding officer, but not enough to implicate her if this goes wrong. Margaret stood up. And Lieutenant, I need you to understand something. This operation has a high probability of failure. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and working without support. You're young. You have your whole career ahead of you. If you walk away right now, I won't think less of you. Would you walk away? No. Then neither will I. Marcus stood as well, extending his hand. My father said you were worth following into hell. I'm about to find out if he was right. Margaret shook his hand, feeling the calluses that marked him as a shooter, the firm grip that spoke of confidence without arrogance. He was wrong about one thing. What's that? This isn't hell. Hell comes after, when you're trying to justify the things you did to survive. Done. Margaret spent the next 18 hours preparing with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through 2 decades of operations. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she ran through tactical scenarios, reviewed satellite imagery, and forced her body through training exercises that left her muscles screaming and her joints aching. She was not 28 anymore. Her body made that clear with every sprint, every drop to prone, every tactical roll. but her mind compensated, finding efficient movements where youth would rely on brute force. At 0300 hours, her phone buzzed. Sarah. "You're still awake," her daughter said without preamble. "So are you." "I can't sleep. I keep thinking about—" Sarah's voice cracked. "Mom, I looked you up. After you told me the truth, I used my security clearance to access your service record." Margaret's blood went cold. "Sarah, those files are classified." "I know. I'll probably face consequences. But I needed to know." Sarah was crying now. "You have 3 silver stars, 2 bronze stars with valor, a Navy Cross. You saved 73 lives in combat. You killed 47 enemy combatants. You were declared KIA twice and came back both times." "Sarah, and now you're going to do it again. You're going to run some impossible mission because that's what you do. That's who you are." Sarah took a shuddering breath. "I'm sorry I didn't understand before. I'm sorry I thought you were just ordinary. I am ordinary. I just had an extraordinary job." "No, Mom, you're not ordinary. You're a hero. And I spent my whole life not knowing it because your heroism was classified." Sarah's voice strengthened. "So I need you to know something. If you don't come back, if this mission is your last, I want you to know I'm proud of you. I'm proud of what you did. I'm proud of who you are." Margaret's throat tightened. "I'm coming back. Promise me." "I can't promise that, but I can promise I'll fight like hell to make it happen." "Then fight. And Mom, when you save your friend, when you prove to everyone that age is just a number and experience beats youth, make sure someone records it, because I want your grandchildren to know what their grandmother was capable of." After they hung up, Margaret allowed herself 2 minutes to cry. 2 minutes to feel the weight of everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd hidden, everything she'd been. Then she wiped her eyes, finished her preparations, and drove to the meeting coordinates. Marcus was already there, his truck loaded with equipment cases that definitely weren't filled with camping gear. He looked tired but alert, running on the same adrenaline and duty that powered Margaret. "My CO called me this morning," he said as Margaret approached. "Asked if I knew anything about Margaret Chen, making inquiries about Hawk Morrison." "What did you say?" "I said I'd never heard of Margaret Chen. Then I submitted my leave paperwork and turned off my phone." Marcus opened the back of his truck. "I'm officially on personal leave for the next 72 hours. What I do with that time is nobody's business but mine." "Good." Margaret began inspecting the equipment. "Walk me through what you brought." The next hour was spent reviewing gear, checking weapons, and developing their tactical approach. Marcus had brought everything from Margaret's list, plus several items she hadn't thought of, proof that his Team 6 training was current and comprehensive. "The compound has 3 primary access points," Marcus said, spreading satellite images across the truck bed. "Main gate here, service entrance on the east side, and what looks like an old maintenance tunnel on the north perimeter. All 3 will be monitored. So we don't use any of them." Margaret traced a line along the western edge. "This ridgeline overlooks the compound from 800 meters. We establish observation here, map their security patterns, identify weaknesses." "That's a long shot for an entry." "We're not entering from there. We're using it to identify where they're not looking." Margaret pointed to a dry wash that ran within 200 meters of the compound's southern wall. "Flash floods carved this out. It's deep enough for concealment if we move during their shift change." Marcus studied the terrain. "You're talking about a daylight approach. They'll expect us to come at night. Everyone thinks darkness provides concealment, but darkness also triggers heightened security, more frequent patrols, thermal imaging." Margaret smiled slightly. "Midday, during the hottest part of the day, when everyone's tired and uncomfortable and just wants their shift to end, that's when people get complacent." "That's actually brilliant. It's experience. I've run more extractions than I can count. The ones that failed were usually the ones that followed conventional tactics." Margaret folded the images. "We have one advantage Victor doesn't expect. I'm not coming in as a young operator with something to prove. I'm coming in as an older woman who's learned that patience and timing beat aggression every time." They loaded the truck and began the long drive toward Arizona. Marcus drove the first shift while Margaret reviewed their intelligence one more time, committing every detail to memory. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said after an hour of silence. "You can ask. I might not answer." "Why didn't you tell your daughter about who you were, what you did?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Because I wanted her to have a normal life. I wanted her to grow up without fear, without the knowledge that her mother was constantly in danger. I wanted her to be proud of me for ordinary reasons, good grades, soccer games, college graduation, not for classified operations she could never talk about." "Did it work?" "For 32 years, yes. She had a normal childhood, a stable life. She never had to worry about whether I was coming home." Margaret stared out the window at the passing desert. "But the cost was that she never really knew me. Not the real me. The person I was before I became a mother and a widow." "Do you regret it?" "Every single day. But I'd make the same choice again." Margaret glanced at him. "Are you close with your fiancé?" "Very. We've been together for 5 years, getting married next spring." "Does she know what you really do?" "She knows I'm a SEAL. She knows I deploy frequently and can't talk about my work. She doesn't know the details." Marcus's hands tightened on the wheel. "I tell myself it's to protect her, but maybe I'm just protecting myself from her judgment. What would she think if she knew you were on this mission?" "She'd be terrified. And proud. Probably in equal measure." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "She lost her brother in Afghanistan, IED attack, so she understands duty and sacrifice, but she also understands loss." "Then when this is over, tell her the truth. All of it. Don't make my mistake of waiting 30 years to be honest with the people you love." They drove through the night, switching drivers every 2 hours, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks. By dawn, they were positioned on the ridgeline overlooking Victor's compound, hidden among the rocks with their observation equipment. Through the high-powered scope, Margaret could see the compound clearly. 12 buildings arranged in a defensive pattern. Guards rotating in predictable patterns. And in the center, the medical facility where Hawk was being held. 2 guards on the medical building, Marcus whispered, rotating every 4 hours based on the patterns I'm seeing. Shift change at 0600, 1000, 1400, 1800, 2200, and 0200. "The 1400 shift change," Margaret said. "Hottest part of the day. Guards will be tired, distracted, eager to get inside to the air conditioning." "You're sure about this approach?" "No, but it's our best option." Margaret lowered the scope. "We wait here until 13:30. Use the time to rest, hydrate, prepare. Then we move." The next 6 hours tested Margaret's patience more than any firefight ever had. Waiting was always the hardest part, lying still while your muscles cramped. Your mind raced, and every instinct screamed at you to move, to act, to do something. But patience was a weapon, one Victor wouldn't expect her to have. At 13:15, Margaret and Marcus began their approach. They moved slowly, using the terrain for concealment, staying in the deep shadows of the wash where the midday sun couldn't reach. Margaret's knees protested every crouch, every crawl, but she ignored the pain. Pain was just information. She could process information later. They reached the position closest to the southern wall at 13:28, 2 minutes before the planned guard rotation. Through her scope, Margaret watched the guards at the medical facility. One was yawning, the other checking his watch, both ready for relief. "They're expecting their replacements," Marcus whispered. "Interior discipline is starting to break down." "Good." Margaret tracked the new guards emerging from the main building. "On my mark, we move to the wall breach point. Fast but controlled. No noise." The guards completed their exchange. The exhausted ones headed inside. The fresh ones took their positions but immediately started a conversation, exactly the kind of complacency Margaret had been counting on. "Mark." They moved like shadows, covering the open ground in seconds and pressing against the compound's southern wall. Margaret pulled out a small device, a wall scanner that used ground-penetrating radar to map the structure behind the concrete. "Rebar every 18 inches, she whispered. "But there's a weak point here. Old repair work that didn't properly integrate with the original structure." Marcus set a small-shaped charge carefully calculated to breach the wall without creating enough noise to alert the entire compound. 30 seconds. They moved to a protected position. The charge detonated with a muffled crack, and suddenly they had a hole just large enough to slip through. Inside the compound, Margaret's heart rate stayed steady, the result of decades of training overriding natural fear responses. They were in enemy territory now. Every second mattered. They moved through the narrow space between buildings using security camera blind spots Marcus had identified during their observation. 3 guards passed within 10 feet of their position, never suspecting anyone had breached the perimeter. The medical facility was 50 meters away. Between them and the target open ground, 2 guard positions and security measures they couldn't predict from satellite imagery. "I count 4 tangos with direct line of sight to the medical entrance," Marcus whispered. "We can't reach it without being spotted." "We're not going through the entrance," Margaret pointed to the roof. "Ventilation system. These old buildings always have oversized ducts for desert cooling. If we can access the roof, we can enter from above." "That's a 15-foot climb with no cover." "So we create cover." Margaret pulled out a small drone civilian model, the kind tourists used for photography. "You brought the fireworks." Marcus grinned despite the tension. "Always." He quickly attached a small pyrotechnic device to the drone and sent it flying toward the compound's western perimeter. 30 seconds later, it detonated with a spectacular flash and loud bang. Nothing dangerous, just attention-grabbing. Every guard in the compound turned toward the explosion. In that moment of distraction, Margaret and Marcus sprinted to the medical building and began scaling the wall using climbing gear designed for speed rather than stealth. They reached the roof in 20 seconds, just as the guards were starting to realize the explosion had been a diversion. Margaret immediately located the ventilation access and began working the locks. "Company coming," Marcus warned, tracking guard movements through his scope. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they establish a perimeter. Then we better work fast." Margaret got the vent open and dropped inside, landing in a crouch in what appeared to be a supply room. Marcus followed immediately, pulling the vent cover back into place behind them. They were inside. Now came the hard part, finding Hawk Morrison in a facility designed to hold prisoners without alerting anyone to their presence. And somewhere in this building, Viktor Dimitrov was waiting. The supply room smelled like antiseptic and fear. Margaret pressed her ear against the door, listening for movement in the corridor beyond. Footsteps, 2 sets moving away from their position. She held up 2 fingers to Marcus, then gestured left. They slipped into the hallway, weapons raised, moving with the practiced silence of operators who'd learned that noise meant death. The medical facility was larger than the satellite imagery suggested, at least 20 rooms branching off the main corridor, any one of which could be holding Hawk. "We need to split up," Marcus whispered. "Cover more ground." "No," Margaret's voice was firm. "That's what Viktor expects. The moment we separate, he can isolate and eliminate us individually. We stay together." A door opened ahead. Margaret and Marcus pressed into a darkened doorway as a guard walked past, close enough that Margaret could smell his cigarette smoke. He passed without seeing them, but her heart hammered against her ribs. They'd been inside less than 3 minutes and already had multiple close calls. The next room they checked was empty, except for medical equipment that looked decades old. The room after that contained 3 beds, all empty, but recently used based on the rumpled sheets. The third room was locked with a keypad entry system. "This one," Margaret said quietly. Electronic locks meant something valuable inside. Marcus pulled out a bypass device, but before he could attach it, the keypad beeped and the door opened from the inside. A doctor emerged, white coat, stethoscope, tired eyes that went wide when he saw Margaret's weapon pointed at his chest. "Don't make a sound," Margaret whispered in Russian. A gamble, but Viktor's operation had Soviet roots. "Where is the American prisoner?" The doctor's hands went up slowly. "Please, I'm just trying to help." "Where is he?" Margaret pressed the barrel against the doctor's sternum. "Last chance. Room 7, end of the hall." "But you can't!" Margaret struck him precisely behind the ear, catching his body before it hit the floor. They dragged him into the room zip-tied. His hands and feet gagged him with medical tape. "Room 7, Marcus said. "That's past 2 guard stations." Then we go around. Margaret studied the facility layout, mentally mapping the building from what they'd observed. These old Soviet-style structures always have service corridors for maintenance, should run parallel to the main hallway. They found the service corridor access behind a supply cabinet. The passage was narrow, dark, and smelled like mold, but it ran the length of the building. Through ventilation grates, they could see into the rooms they passed. Room 4, empty. Room 5, 2 guards playing cards. Room 6, equipment storage. Room 7. Through the grate, Margaret could see him. Hawk Morrison strapped to a hospital bed, his face bruised and swollen. An IV line ran into his arm. Monitoring equipment beeped steadily. He was alive, but barely. His chest moved with shallow breaths that suggested broken ribs, or worse. 2 guards stood inside the room. A third sat in a chair by the door reading a magazine. 3 tangos, Marcus whispered. We can't take them quietly. Not all 3 at once. We don't have to. Margaret pulled out a small gas canister sedative compound, fast-acting but short duration. Vent system feeds directly into that room. 30 seconds after release, they'll be unconscious. We'll have maybe 3 minutes before someone notices they missed their radio check. That's not enough time to extract Hawk and get clear. I know. Margaret met his eyes. Which is why you're taking Hawk out the way we came in. I'll create a diversion, pull security away from your exit route. That's suicide. That's tactics. Victor wants me, not you. The moment I reveal myself, every asset in this compound will focus on capturing me. That gives you a clear path to extract Hawk. I'm not leaving you behind. You're not leaving me. You're completing the mission. Margaret's voice went hard. Hawk needs immediate medical attention. You can provide it. I can't. So you get him out, stabilize him, call for extraction. Then if I'm still alive, you can come back for me. Marcus's jaw worked silently. Your daughter will never forgive me. My daughter will understand that I made the choice any operator would make: mission success over personal survival. Margaret attached the gas canister to the vent. On my count, 3, 2, 1. She released the sedative. Through the grate, they watched as the guards suddenly swayed, confused, then collapsed one by one. 30 seconds, just as promised. They dropped into the room. Marcus immediately went to Hawk, checking vitals, disconnecting the IV with practiced efficiency. Margaret covered the door, listening for any sign they'd been detected. Hawk's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. Maggie. His voice was barely a whisper. You shouldn't... Trap. I know it's a trap. Shut up and let Marcus work. Margaret glanced back. Her old friend looked worse up close. Definitely broken ribs, possible internal bleeding, signs of systematic torture. Can you move him? Not without risking further injury. He needs a stretcher, medical support time. Marcus injected something into Hawk's arm. Best I can do is stabilize him for transport and hope nothing tears loose when we move. Then do it fast. We're out of time. As if summoning it, an alarm started blaring throughout the compound. Someone had discovered their breach. Go, Margaret said. Now, service corridor back to the roof, down the wall. You remember the extraction point? 2 clicks west, the dried riverbed. Marcus finished securing Hawk in a fireman's carry. Maggie, I can't just... You can and you will. That's an order, Lieutenant. Margaret moved to the door. I'll give you 10 minutes. Use them. She stepped into the hallway before Marcus could argue further. Guards were already responding to the alarm, converging from both ends of the corridor. Margaret fired twice, dropping the nearest ones, then ran toward the facility's central atrium, the opposite direction from Marcus's escape route. Behind her, she heard Marcus cursing, then the sound of him moving quickly down the service corridor with Hawk. Good. He was following orders. The atrium was chaos. Guards shouting, weapons being readied, security protocols being implemented. Margaret burst through the double doors and immediately assessed the tactical situation. 20 hostiles, maybe more. Multiple levels with overlapping fields of fire. Every exit covered. She was trapped, exactly as planned. Margaret Chen, the voice came from the second-level balcony, amplified through speakers. Viktor Dimitrov stepped into view, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Margaret's car. He was younger than she expected, 45, handsome in a cold way with his father's eyes. 25 years I've waited for this moment. Margaret kept her weapon raised, tracking multiple targets simultaneously. Sorry for the wait. I've been busy. Amusing. I appreciate that you maintain your composure even when surrounded. Victor gestured, and a dozen laser sights appeared on Margaret's chest. Please lower your weapon. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Let's be civilized about this. Civilized? Margaret's voice dripped with contempt. Your father was developing bioweapons to use on civilian populations. There's nothing civilized about that. My father was a scientist, a genius who understood that the world's problems required radical solutions. Victor's voice hardened. You murdered him, shot him in cold blood while he was unarmed and surrendering. He was reaching for a detonator that would have released nerve agent across 3 city blocks. I didn't murder him, I stopped a terrorist. Margaret slowly lowered her weapon but didn't release it. And now you're following in his footsteps, building your own terrorist network, trafficking weapons, planning attacks. Like father, like son. You know nothing about me. I know you grabbed Hawk Morrison as bait. I know you've been waiting 25 years for revenge. I know you're so focused on making me pay that you're about to make a critical mistake. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. And what mistake would that be? You assumed I came alone. For just a second, Victor's certainty flickered. In that second, Margaret moved. She threw a flashbang toward the guards clustered near the east exit dove behind a concrete planter and came up firing. 3 guards down before they could react. The atrium erupted into gunfire. Rounds sparked off concrete, shattered glass, tore through furniture. Margaret kept moving, using the chaos she'd created to stay ahead of the targeting solutions. She wasn't trying to win this fight, just survive it long enough for Marcus to clear the compound with Hawk. She counted seconds in her head. 60 since Marcus left the medical room. He'd need at least 5 minutes to reach the roof access, another 3 to make the descent, 2 more to reach the perimeter wall. 10 minutes total. She had to last 10 minutes. A guard rushed her position. Margaret shot him twice center mass, then rolled to new cover as his companions returned fire. Her old body protested the movement joints, screaming, but she ignored it. Pain later, survival now. Stop firing! Victor's voice cut through the chaos. I want her alive. The gunfire ceased, but the laser sights remained locked on her position. Margaret used the pause to check her ammunition. 2 magazines left, maybe 50 rounds. Against 20+ hostiles. There's no escape, Victor called out. Every exit is covered. Your friend is already being recaptured by my exterior teams. Surrender now and I'll make this quick. Margaret said nothing instead, using the time to map the atrium's architecture. 3 levels connected by open stairs. Windows on the upper levels, bullet-resistant glass but not bulletproof. A skylight above that looked like it might be vulnerable. I know what you're thinking, Victor continued. You're calculating odds, looking for tactical advantages, planning some desperate gambit. But Margaret, you're 58 years old. How long can you really keep this up? How many more times can you dive and roll before your body simply gives out? He wasn't wrong. Margaret's knees were already throbbing, her shoulder aching from the recoil, her breathing coming harder than it should. She was running on experience and stubbornness, but those only carried you so far against youth and numbers. 5 minutes, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Marcus needed 5 more minutes. What was that? Victor leaned over the balcony railing. Did you say something? Margaret popped up from cover and fired at the skylight. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. She ducked back as return fire forced her down. Interesting. Victor sounded genuinely curious. You're not trying to escape. You're buying time. For whom I wonder Commander Morrison is secured. You came alone, or so you claimed. Unless... His voice went cold. Search the compound. Find whoever else is here. Now. Guards scattered, following orders with military precision. Margaret's window was closing. If they found Marcus before he cleared the compound, this entire operation failed. She stood up, stepped out of cover, weapon hanging loose at her side. You want me, Victor? Here I am. Let's finish this. You and me. No guards, no backup. Just the 2 of us settling accounts for your father. Victor studied her for a long moment. You think I'm fool enough to accept a challenge from a desperate woman? I think you've spent 25 years building up this moment in your mind. The legendary Margaret Chen, the woman who killed your father, finally at your mercy. But if your guards are the ones who capture me, if they're the ones who bring me down, then your revenge is hollow. You didn't beat me, they did. It was a transparent manipulation playing on ego and emotion. But Victor was his father's son, and his father had been brilliant, but arrogant. That arrogance had gotten him killed. That arrogance might save Margaret's life. Fine. Victor pulled out a pistol, checked the magazine with practiced ease. Clear the atrium, give us space, but stay close when I'm finished. I want her medical team ready. She's going to suffer a very long time before she dies. The guards withdrew, taking positions outside the atrium, but remaining within sight. Margaret counted 13 visible, probably more in reserve. Even if she beat Victor, she wasn't walking out of here. But that was fine. She just needed to buy time. Victor descended the stairs slowly, his weapon trained on Margaret, but not firing. They faced each other across 20 feet of open space. The older woman who'd killed his father, the younger man who'd spent half his life planning revenge. "Before we begin," Victor said, "I want you to know that your friend Morrison suffered. Broken bones, psychological torture, medical experiments. I made sure he experienced a fraction of what you took from me when you murdered my father. Your father was a monster who weaponized diseases. Hawk Morrison is a decorated soldier who spent his life protecting people. They're not comparable. From where I stand, you're both soldiers who killed in service of your governments. The only difference is which flag you served." Victor's gun didn't waver. "My father believed in a world order beyond nationalism. He believed in science, progress, evolution beyond primitive tribal loyalties. He believed in mass murder for profit. Don't dress it up as philosophy. And you believed in American exceptionalism, that your violence was noble while ours was terrorism." Victor's smile was bitter. "We're not so different, Margaret. We both kill for what we believe in. The only difference is who writes the history. The difference is I stopped people from dying. Your father caused death." Margaret's voice stayed level. "And now you're following his path. The bioweapon I saw in your research files, you're planning to use it, aren't you? That's what this is really about. Not just revenge, but continuation. You want to finish what he started." Victor's expression confirmed it before he spoke. "Fort Huachuca, military intelligence base. 3,500 soldiers and civilians. The bioweapon will breach security systems using your friend Morrison's biometric data, then disperse through the ventilation. Symptoms begin in 6 hours, death in 72. Untreatable, unstoppable." Margaret's blood went cold. "You're insane." "I'm committed. There's a difference." Victor raised his weapon slightly. "And you're stalling. Your associate, whoever you brought, has had enough time to clear the immediate area. My exterior teams will capture him shortly. Your diversion bought him nothing except delaying the inevitable." He was right about the stalling. Margaret's internal clock had counted past 10 minutes. Marcus should be clear of the compound by now, hopefully far enough away that Victor's exterior teams wouldn't catch him. But Victor was wrong about the rest. Marcus wasn't running away. He was a SEAL, which meant he was circling back, finding a position, preparing for whatever came next. Margaret just had to survive long enough for that plan to matter. "Your move," Victor said. "Fight me or die standing there. Either way, this ends today." Margaret raised her weapon in response. They stood frozen for 3 heartbeats, 2 operators with decades of training, each calculating angles and timing and probability. Victor fired first. Margaret was already moving, dropping and rolling left as the round passed through space she'd occupied a split second before. She came up firing, forcing Victor into cover behind a concrete pillar. They traded shots, neither finding a clean angle, both too experienced to make rookie mistakes. Margaret's ammunition counter dropped 40 rounds, 35-30. She couldn't maintain this pace. A window exploded inward. Margaret flinched, turning toward the sound, and realized her mistake too late. Victor's diversion had worked. She'd taken her eyes off him for just a second. His next shot caught her in the left shoulder, spinning her around. The impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. Her weapon clattered the way across the floor. Margaret dropped behind cover, her left arm, useless blood soaking through her shirt. The pain was extraordinary, but she forced it down, forced herself to think tactically. Secondary weapons still had her backup pistol, knife, 2 grenades. Not helpless yet. "Painful, isn't it?" Victor called out. "That's just the beginning. I'm going to spend days teaching you about pain. Years if your body holds up." Margaret pulled her backup weapon with her right hand, awkward but functional. "You talk too much. Your father had the same problem." She blind fired around the corner, not trying to hit Victor but forcing him to keep his head down. Then she moved, ignoring the screaming agony in her shoulder, reaching for her primary weapon where it had fallen. Victor anticipated the move. His next shot hit her in the right thigh and Margaret went down hard. Both legs still worked, but running was now impossible. She was effectively immobile. Victor emerged from cover, weapon trained on her center mass. "I could end this now. Quick shot to the head and you'd never feel it. But where's the justice in that? You took my father from me, slowly made him suffer before he died. I think you deserve the same courtesy." Margaret's backup weapon was in her hand, but Victor was too far away for an accurate shot with her offhand, and she was too injured to close the distance. Her tactical options had shrunk to almost nothing, which meant it was time to change the game entirely. "The bioweapon," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "You can't deploy it." "I can and I will. The device is already in place, armed and waiting for activation codes I'll transmit once I'm finished here." "No, you misunderstood me." Margaret managed a bloody smile. "I'm not saying you shouldn't deploy it. I'm saying you can't. Because 3 days ago, Fort Huachuca received an anonymous tip about a potential bioweapon threat. They've been running full containment protocols since then. Your attack window closed before you even grabbed Hawk Morrison." Victor's expression flickered, just for a second, but enough to tell Margaret she'd struck a nerve. "You're lying." "Am I? How confident are you?" "Confident enough to activate a bioweapon that won't work and will expose your entire network to U.S. military intelligence." Margaret shifted her weight slightly, preparing for a move she wasn't sure she could make. "Admiral Hayes may not be able to authorize a rescue mission, but she can absolutely order security protocols based on credible intelligence, which I provided." "Impossible. You've been planning this rescue. You couldn't have." "I'm 58 years old, Victor. I've been playing this game since before you were born. You think I walked into your trap without contingencies?" Margaret's voice hardened. "The bioweapon fails. Your compound is surrounded by military assets who've been tracking our movements since we breached your perimeter. And you're about to learn what every young operator eventually learns: experience beats youth every single time." Victor's weapon wavered, just slightly, just for a second, but Margaret had been waiting for exactly that moment. She threw her knife. It wasn't a killing throw. Her left arm was useless and her right wasn't strong enough for the distance. But it didn't need to kill. It just needed to distract. Victor dodged instinctively, and in that split second of divided attention, the skylight finally shattered. Marcus Webb dropped through on a repelling line weapon, firing before he even reached the ground. His first 3 shots forced Victor into cover. His next burst took out 2 guards rushing back into the atrium. He landed next to Margaret, already pulling a medical kit from his tactical vest. "You said 10 minutes. It's been 15. I got held up." Margaret gritted her teeth as Marcus applied a quick clot bandage to her shoulder. "Hawk. Stable. Hidden in the riverbed with emergency beacon activated. Navy's sending a medical helicopter, ETA 20 minutes. Marcus helped her sit up against the concrete planter. "Can you shoot?" Margaret tested her right arm, painful but functional. "Give me a weapon and find out." Marcus handed her his backup pistol, then returned fire as guards began flooding back into the atrium. "We're pinned down. No clear exit. That helicopter better hurry." "We don't need an exit." Margaret pointed with her good hand. "We need leverage." Victor had taken cover behind the same concrete pillar as before, but now he was trapped. Marcus controlled the skylight approach. Margaret had an angle on his position. The guards couldn't provide supporting fire without risking hitting their own leader. "Victor," Margaret called out. "It's over. You can surrender and face trial, or you can die here. Your choice." "I still have the activation codes," Victor shouted back. One transmission and the bioweapon deploys regardless of containment protocols. Then transmit them. Go ahead. Margaret kept her weapon trained on his position. Show me I was wrong about Fort Huachuca. Kill 3,000 people because you couldn't handle your father being stopped from killing even more. Silence from behind the pillar. Margaret counted seconds. 5, 10, 15. You weren't lying, Victor said finally. His voice had lost its confident edge. The base is locked down. I never lie about operational intelligence. That's how people die. So what now? I surrender, get life in prison, and you go home, the hero. I go home a tired woman who did what needed to be done. You go to trial and answer for your crimes. It's not heroic, it's just necessary. More silence. Then Victor stepped out from cover, his weapon on the ground, hands raised. I surrender. Marcus kept his weapon trained on Victor as he approached, zip-tied his hands behind his back with professional efficiency. Target secured. We need immediate extraction for 3 persons, multiple injuries, high-value prisoner in custody. Margaret slumped against the concrete, exhaustion and pain finally catching up to her. They'd done it. Hawk was safe. Victor was captured. The bioweapon neutralized. But she'd been shot twice, lost a significant amount of blood, and was probably going into shock. Her body, which had carried her through this operation on pure, stubborn will, was finally demanding payment. Stay with me, Marcus said, moving back to her position. Medic's on the way. I'm not going anywhere. Margaret's voice was getting weaker. Tell Sarah. Tell my daughter I kept my promise. You can tell her yourself. Marcus applied pressure to her thigh wound. You don't get to die after that speech about experience beating youth. You have to live long enough to prove it. Margaret laughed, which turned into a cough that sent spikes of pain through her shoulder. Deal. The helicopter rotors grew louder overhead, but Margaret barely heard them through the ringing in her ears. Marcus was talking to someone on his radio, coordinating extraction, but his words sounded distant and muffled. She recognized the signs, shock setting in her body, finally acknowledging the damage it had sustained. Margaret, stay awake. Marcus's face appeared in her field of vision. Medical team is 90 seconds out. You need to stay conscious. I'm conscious, she said, though her voice sounded strange even to herself. Just resting my eyes. No resting. Talk to me. Tell me about Mogadishu. Margaret forced her eyes open. You want war stories now? I want you talking. Conscious people talk. Marcus applied fresh pressure to her thigh wound, and the pain snapped her back to full awareness. My dad said you fought for 6 hours straight with a collapsed lung. True or exaggeration? 5 hours. He exaggerates. Margaret tried to shift position and immediately regretted it. Collapsed lung was the easy part. The hard part was convincing Hawk to leave me behind. He didn't, though. No. Stubborn bastard came back, dragged me 6 miles while I bled all over him. Margaret coughed, tasted copper. Told him I'd kill him if we survived. He laughed. You two must be close. Close as you can be with someone who's seen you at your worst and still thinks you're worth saving. Margaret's vision blurred, then cleared. Where is he now? Still in the riverbed with the emergency beacon. The first helicopter will extract him more critical injuries. Second bird is coming for us and Victor. Marcus checked his watch. 60 seconds. Victor sat against the wall nearby, hands zip-tied, blood trickling from where Marcus had hit him during the takedown. He was staring at Margaret with an expression somewhere between hate and grudging respect. You knew, Victor said. About the bioweapon failure. You knew before you even entered this compound. Margaret turned her head toward him, the movement requiring more effort than it should. I suspected. Fort Huachuca runs security drills constantly. Once I knew you were targeting them, I fed intelligence suggesting a credible bioweapon threat. They locked down 48 hours ago. Then this entire operation, grabbing Morrison, the deadline, the trap, it was all for nothing. Not for nothing. You're captured. Your network is compromised. And Hawk's alive. Margaret managed a thin smile. From where I'm sitting, that's a pretty successful operation. You're dying. I've been dying for 58 years, just taking longer than expected. The first helicopter touched down outside the compound, medical team rushing in with a stretcher. They went straight for Margaret, triaging her wounds with professional efficiency that reminded her of her own combat medic days. 2 GSWs, significant blood loss, possible shock. One medic reported into his radio. Patient is alert but deteriorating. We need immediate transport. Hawk first, Margaret said, trying to sit up. Commander Morrison, he's critical. Morrison's already being loaded on the first bird, the medic assured her. You're going on the second with the prisoner. Now hold still while I get this IV started. Margaret felt the needle slide into her arm, felt the cold rush of fluids entering her system. Her body wanted to shut down, surrender to the exhaustion and pain, but her mind kept fighting. Mission wasn't complete until everyone was extracted safely. Sarah, she said suddenly. My daughter. Someone needs to call her. Already done, Marcus said, appearing at her side. I called her before we breached the compound. Left a message saying you were on a job, would be home soon, not to worry. She's going to worry anyway. She's your daughter. That's what daughters do. Marcus helped the medics lift her onto the stretcher. You can explain everything when you're stable. The transfer to the helicopter was a blur of motion and pain. Margaret caught glimpses, Victor being loaded separately, guards in custody, the compound being secured by military personnel who'd apparently been on standby the entire time. Admiral Hayes hadn't been able to authorize a rescue, but she damn sure positioned assets to respond when the situation changed. Inside the helicopter, a Navy corpsman worked on Margaret's wounds, while Marcus maintained security on Victor. The rotors spun up and they lifted away from the compound that had nearly become her grave. How bad, Margaret asked the corpsman. Shoulder wound went clean through missed major arteries. Thigh wound is more concerning, possible bone involvement, significant tissue damage. You'll need surgery, probably physical therapy. The corpsman adjusted her IV flow. But you'll live. Might have a limp, might lose some shoulder mobility, but you'll live. Good enough. Margaret closed her eyes, then forced them open again. Victor, is he secured? Fully restrained and under guard, Marcus confirmed. He's not going anywhere except federal custody. Victor spoke for the first time since boarding. You should have killed me. Margaret turned her head to look at him. I'm not an executioner. I'm a soldier. There's a difference. My father was a soldier too. You killed him anyway. Your father had a detonator in his hand and 6 canisters of nerve agent ready to deploy. I made a tactical decision that saved thousands of lives. Margaret's voice hardened, despite her weakness. If you'd been in my position, you'd have made the same choice. I would have found another way. There wasn't another way. That's what you don't understand. Sometimes there are only bad choices and worse choices. Your father forced me to make a bad choice by planning something worse. And now you've forced me into the same position. Victor's eyes were cold. Captured, humiliated, imprisoned for life. You've taken everything from me. No. I've taken your freedom and your ability to hurt people, but you still have your life, which is more than you gave the people your weapons killed. Margaret held his gaze. You want to hate me, fine. I can live with that. But don't pretend you're the victim here. You chose this path. You chose to follow your father's legacy of violence. You chose to grab an innocent man and torture him for revenge. Those were your choices, Victor. Own them. The helicopter banked, and Margaret felt her stomach lurch. The corpsman immediately checked her vitals, concerned about internal injuries, but she waved him off. Just motion sickness. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're in shock. You've lost at least 2 pints of blood, and your body temperature is dropping. The corpsman wrapped her in thermal blankets. But you're stable enough for transport. We'll have you in surgery within the hour. The flight to the military hospital took 30 minutes that felt like 3 hours. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind unable to maintain focus despite her best efforts. She caught fragments of radio communication. Hawk was in surgery, stable but critical. Victor was being transferred to a secure facility. Admiral Hayes was en route to the hospital for debriefing. When they finally landed, medical personnel swarmed the helicopter. Margaret was rushed through corridors that blurred together, through doors that opened and closed into bright rooms with too many people asking too many questions. Margaret Sullivan, 58 years old, 2 gunshot wounds, significant blood loss. Type and cross-match for surgery prep, OR3. Family contact, next of kin. My daughter, Margaret managed to say. Sarah Sullivan. She's in the system. Then she was being wheeled into an operating room, bright lights overhead, masked faces surrounding her, someone counting backward from 10 as anesthesia flooded her system. She made it to 7 before everything went dark. Margaret woke to the sound of machines beeping and the smell of antiseptic. Hospital room private based on the quiet. Her shoulder and leg throbbed with deep, persistent pain that morphine was dulling but not eliminating. Mom. Sarah's face appeared above her eyes, red from crying expression caught between relief and fury. You're awake. Thank God you're awake. How long? Margaret's voice came out as a croak. 6 hours since surgery. They said it went well. They repaired the damage. No permanent disability expected with proper physical therapy. Sarah grabbed her hand, squeezed too hard. You promised me you'd come back. You promised. I'm back. You got shot twice. You nearly died. Sarah's voice cracked. The doctor said another inch on either wound and you wouldn't have made it. But I did make it. Experience beats youth, remember? Margaret tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. Is Hawk okay? Commander Morrison is in ICU, stable condition. They're optimistic about his recovery. Sarah wiped her eyes. Admiral Hayes has been here 3 times asking when you'll be awake for debriefing. I told her you needed rest first. Katie never did understand the concept of rest. Katie? Sarah's eyebrows rose. You're on a first-name basis with an admiral. We served together. She was Lieutenant Hayes back then, fresh out of Annapolis, convinced she was going to change the world. Margaret shifted in the bed, trying to find a position that hurt less. She did change it, just not the way she expected. The door opened and Admiral Catherine Hayes walked in, still in uniform despite the late hour. At 63, she carried herself with the rigid bearing of someone who'd spent 4 decades in military service. Her face was weathered, but sharp eyes missing nothing. You look terrible, she said to Margaret. You always did know how to charm a lady. Hayes turned to Sarah. Ms. Sullivan, I need a few minutes alone with your mother. Classified debriefing. Sarah started to protest, but Margaret squeezed her hand. It's okay. Go get coffee. Call the kids, check on your husband. I'll be here when you get back. After Sarah left, reluctantly, Hayes pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down with a heavy sigh. That was the most reckless, unauthorized, potentially career-ending operation I've ever not witnessed. You're welcome. I should have you court-martialed, arrested, dishonorably discharged 15 years after retirement just to make a point. Hayes's voice softened. Instead, I'm going to recommend you for a classified commendation that you'll never be able to tell anyone about. Story of my life. Viktor Dimitrov is in federal custody facing terrorism charges that will put him away for life. His network is being rolled up as we speak. We've already arrested 14 associates across 3 countries. The bioweapon research has been secured and is being studied for countermeasures. Hayes leaned back. Hawk Morrison is alive because of you. 3,000 soldiers and civilians at Fort Huachuca are alive because you stopped that attack. And you did it with one operator and a prayer. Marcus Webb deserves most of the credit. Without him, I'd be dead, and Hawk would still be in that compound. Lieutenant Webb is currently being debriefed by his commanding officer about why he went AWOL for 48 hours. Hayes's expression was unreadable. His story is that he took personal leave to visit family in Arizona and got caught up in a terrorist incident. Pure coincidence. And his CO believes that his CO is smart enough to know when not to ask follow-up questions. Hayes stood up. Webb's career is intact. Yours is still classified. Hawk's recovery will be attributed to a classified rescue operation that didn't officially happen. And Victor will go to trial without any mention of how he was captured. So nothing changes. Everything changes. We stopped a bioweapon attack. We captured a high-value terrorist. We sent a message to anyone planning similar operations. Hayes moved toward the door, then paused. And you proved something important. What's that? That age and experience matter. That the operators we trained 30 years ago can still run circles around the current generation when it counts. Hayes's voice held genuine respect. You're 58 years old, Maggie. You should be retired, enjoying grandchildren, living a quiet life. Instead, you ran a near impossible operation against superior numbers and won. That means something. After Hayes left, Margaret lay in the dark room processing everything that had happened. Her body hurt in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Her shoulder would need months of physical therapy. Her leg might never fully recover its previous strength. She'd have new scars to add to her collection, new nightmares to process. But Hawk was alive. The bioweapon was stopped. Victor would face justice. She'd done what needed to be done, just like always. The door opened again. Marcus Webb entered quietly, still in civilian clothes, looking exhausted but satisfied. You're awake. Good. I wanted to thank you before I head back to base. You don't need to thank me. You saved my life. After you saved mine by walking into that trap and drawing all the attention away from my exit route with Morrison. Marcus pulled up the chair Hayes had vacated. My CO bought the family emergency story, but he's not stupid. He knows something happened. He's just choosing not to dig deeper. Smart man. He said if I ever pull something like this again, I better make damn sure it works out the same way. Marcus grinned. So you know no pressure for future operations. There won't be future operations. I'm done. Margaret meant it this time. Her body had been clear about its limitations. This was my last mission. Time to actually retire. That's what Morrison said 15 years ago. Then Victor grabbed him and you came out of retirement. Marcus stood up. My guess, you'll be retired until the next time someone needs saving and the Navy can't officially help. Then you'll dust off your gear and do it all over again. I'm 58 years old. And you just ran a hostage rescue that half my Team 6 couldn't have pulled off. Marcus headed for the door. Age is just a number, ma'am. Capability is what matters. And you've got plenty of that left. After he left, Margaret closed her eyes and allowed herself to imagine a real retirement. No more classified missions. No more weapons. No more lying to her daughter about where she was and what she'd done. Just Margaret Sullivan, widow, grandmother, library volunteer. The ordinary life she'd told herself she wanted. The door burst open, and Hawk Morrison wheeled himself in on a hospital wheelchair IV pole attached, looking like death warmed over, but grinning like an idiot. You came for me. Don't sound so surprised. I told Victor you wouldn't. Told him you were smart enough to know it was a trap, smart enough to let me rot rather than risk yourself. Hawk maneuvered his wheelchair closer. I should have known better. You never were that smart. You're welcome, by the way. Thank you. Hawk's grin faded, replaced by genuine emotion. I mean it, Maggie. Thank you. I was 3 days from breaking. Another week and I'd have given them everything. Codes, procedures, intelligence. But you got there first. You'd have held out longer than you think. You're too stubborn to break easy. Maybe, but I'm glad we didn't have to find out. Hawk winced, adjusting his position. The doctors say I'll make a full recovery. Couple months of physical therapy, some counseling for the psychological stuff, but I'll be back to normal. Define normal. You're 62 years old, and you just survived 3 weeks of torture. Normal might need some adjustment. Says the 58-year-old who just ran a hostage rescue with 2 bullets in her. Hawk's eyes were serious now. We're not young anymore, Maggie. Our bodies can't do what they used to, but our minds are sharper than ever. We've got decades of experience, pattern recognition, tactical thinking that the young operators are still learning. You sound like you're trying to convince yourself. I am. Because part of me thinks I should retire, take my pension, disappear into obscurity like we're supposed to. Hawk met her eyes. But the bigger part of me knows that experience matters, that we still have value, that walking away just because we're older means abandoning people who need help. That sounds exhausting. It is. But it's also who we are. Hawk started to wheel himself toward the door, then stopped. By the way, your daughter is terrifying. She cornered me in the ICU and demanded to know if her mother had always been this reckless. I told her yes. Thanks for that. Just being honest. She also said if you ever do anything like this again, she's going to kill you herself. Hawk grinned. I like her. She's got your fire. After he left, Margaret finally allowed herself to relax, let the exhaustion claim her. Let her body begin the long process of healing. The mission was over. Hawk was safe. Victor was captured. The bioweapon was stopped. But Hawk's words echoed in her mind. Experience matters. We still have value. The door opened one more time. Sarah returned with coffee and a determined expression that Margaret recognized from looking in mirrors for 5 decades. We need to talk, Sarah said, about what happens next, about whether you're really retiring or just saying you're retiring, about the fact that I spent 32 years not knowing who my mother really was. Sarah sat down heavily. I've been thinking a lot over the past 6 hours while you were in surgery, and I've made some decisions. Decisions about what? About whether I can accept having a mother who runs classified missions and gets shot at and lies about where she's been. Sarah's voice was steady but emotional. And I've decided that I can. Because the alternative is living without you, and I've already lost Dad. I can't lose you too. Sarah. But I have conditions. First, no more secrets. You don't have to tell me operational details, but if you're going on a mission, I need to know. No more business trips that are actually combat operations. Margaret nodded slowly. Okay, what else? Second, you train me. Basic self-defense, situational awareness, the kind of skills that kept you alive for 30 years. I want to understand your world even if I'm not part of it. That's reasonable. Third, you write everything down. Your real service record, the missions you ran, the people you saved. Not for publication, not for glory, but for your grandchildren, so they know who you really were. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again. I spent 32 years thinking you were ordinary. Your grandchildren deserve to know the truth from the beginning. Margaret reached out with her good hand, and Sarah took it. I can do that, all of it. And fourth, Sarah's voice went firm. You stop putting yourself in situations where I have to get calls about surgery and blood loss and near-death experiences. You're 58 years old, Mom. You've earned the right to stop fighting. I'll try. That's not good enough. It's the best I can offer. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. Sarah, I can't promise I'll never face danger again. My life has been about responding when people need help. That's not something I can just turn off because I'm older. Then promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll think about your family before you throw yourself into impossible situations. Promise me you'll remember that you have people who love you and need you to come home. I promise. They sat in silence for a long moment, mother and daughter finally honest with each other after 3 decades of necessary lies. For what it's worth, Sarah said quietly, I'm proud of you. Terrified, but proud. You saved your friend. True. You stopped a terrorist attack. You proved that age doesn't mean weakness. She wiped her eyes. I just wish I'd known sooner. I wish I'd understood who you were before Dad died. Your father knew. That was enough for me. Was it really? Margaret considered the question honestly. No, but it had to be. The work was classified. The operations were secret. I couldn't share it even with people I loved. She met Sarah's eyes. But now you know, and your children will know. And maybe that makes up for some of the lost years. Maybe. Sarah stood up. Get some rest. The doctor said you need sleep for the healing process. I'll be back tomorrow morning with real food. Hospital food is terrible. After Sarah left, Margaret lay in the dark room and finally allowed herself to feel everything she'd been suppressing. The fear she'd hidden during the operation, the pain she'd ignored while fighting, the exhaustion she'd pushed through to complete the mission. Her body was 58 years old, scarred and damaged, and pushed far beyond its reasonable limits. But it had held together when it mattered. It had gotten her through one more mission, saved one more life stopped, one more threat. Maybe that was enough. Maybe this really could be her last operation, her final mission, her chance to transition from warrior to grandmother. Or maybe Hawk was right. Maybe experience did matter. Maybe age brought wisdom that the young operators needed. Maybe she still had value beyond her physical capabilities. The machines beeped steadily. The morphine dulled the pain to manageable levels. And Margaret Sullivan, Lieutenant Commander Margaret Chen, retired Navy SEAL classified operator, ordinary grandmother, finally closed her eyes and slept. Outside her room, Admiral Hayes spoke quietly with Marcus Webb and a still wheelchair-bound Hawk Morrison. "She thinks she's done," Hayes said. "She always thinks she's done," Hawk replied. "Then something happens and she unretires for one more mission." "The question is whether we let her," Marcus said. "She's 58. This operation nearly killed her. At some point we have to acknowledge that age matters." "Age matters," Hayes agreed, "but so does capability. Margaret just proved she can still run operations that younger operators can't. That knowledge doesn't disappear just because we want her to be safe." "So what do we do?" Marcus asked. Hayes looked through the window at Margaret's sleeping form. "We give her the retirement she's earned. We don't call unless there's no other option, and we hope that option never comes." "And if it does?" Hawk's voice was quiet. "Then we call. Because sometimes the mission matters more than safety. She taught us that." Hayes turned away from the window. "But until then, she's earned her peace." 3 weeks passed before Margaret could walk without limping. 6 weeks before she could lift her arm above her shoulder without wincing. 8 weeks before the nightmares stopped waking her up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, reaching for weapons that weren't there. Physical therapy was brutal. The therapist, a former Army medic named Rodriguez, who'd lost his leg in Iraq, pushed her harder than she thought possible. "You want to get back to normal?" he'd say during sessions that left her sweating and trembling. "Then you work for it. Pain is just weakness leaving the body." "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," Margaret would reply, gritting her teeth through another rep. "Then prove me wrong by finishing the set." She always finished the set. Sarah visited twice a week, bringing the grandchildren, Emma 6 and Tyler 4, who had no idea why Grandma was suddenly so much more interesting. Emma asked constant questions about the scars on Margaret's shoulder and leg. Tyler just wanted her to play superhero with him. "You're Captain America," he'd insist, brandishing a plastic shield. "I'm too old to be Captain America." "No, you're old Captain America. From the end of the movie, when he's old but still cool." Margaret had laughed at that, even though it hurt her ribs. Out of the mouths of 4-year-olds came uncomfortable truths. On a Tuesday morning in late October, Margaret returned to Miller's tactical range for the first time since before the operation. She'd called ahead, asked for lane 12 during off-peak hours. Brad had been apologetic on the phone, clearly uncomfortable about their previous interaction. "Ma'am, about before when you first came in, I was young and making assumptions based on incomplete information." Margaret had finished. "I've done the same thing. Just try to learn from it." Now she stood in lane 12, her weapon feeling heavier than it used to, her stance slightly different to compensate for her still healing shoulder. The tactical course timer was set. All she had to do was press start. She pressed start. The course had gotten harder, or she'd gotten slower, or both. Where she'd once cleared it in 38 seconds, she now finished in 47. Still respectable, still better than 90% of shooters who use this range, but 9 seconds slower than her previous performance. Age and injury had taken their toll. Margaret safed her weapon and stood there for a long moment, processing what that meant. She'd spent 8 weeks telling herself she was healing, getting stronger, returning to her previous capability. But the numbers didn't lie. She was diminished. Not broken, not helpless, but definitely not what she'd been. That was impressive. Margaret turned. A young woman stood at the lane entrance, mid-20s athletic build, wearing an Army combat uniform with sergeant stripes. Her face carried the watchful look of someone who'd seen deployment. 47 seconds on the tactical course, the sergeant continued. "I've been trying to break 50 for 3 months. Practice and patience, Margaret said automatically, and understanding that speed matters less than accuracy under stress. I'm Riley Garrett, second deployment in Afghanistan, transitional assignment stateside while I figure out my next move." Riley gestured at the course. "I heard about you. The instructors here talk about the day some older woman came in and destroyed their course record. They didn't believe it until they checked the security footage. That was before." "Before what?" "Before I got shot twice and spent 8 weeks recovering." Margaret began breaking down her weapon for cleaning. "Now I'm 9 seconds slower and questioning whether I should be here at all." Riley was quiet for a moment. My mom is 56. She served in Desert Storm as a combat medic, saved dozens of lives. When she retired, she told me she felt invisible, like the world stopped seeing her as capable the moment her uniform came off. Your mom is smart. She also said the most dangerous thing a woman can do is believe the world's assessment of her value. Riley met Margaret's eyes. You're 9 seconds slower than your record. You're still faster than me and everyone I know. That doesn't sound like someone who should question being here. Margaret finished cleaning her weapon, considering the words. Your mom sounds like someone I'd like to meet. She'd say the same about you, especially after I tell her I met the legendary Margaret Sullivan. Margaret's head snapped up. How do you know that name? I didn't until Lieutenant Webb's fiancé mentioned it. She works in intelligence analysis. We served together in Kandahar. She told me about a classified operation involving a 58-year-old retired SEAL who rescued a hostage from a fortified compound. Riley's expression was carefully neutral. She didn't give details. Just said if I ever had doubts about whether age matters in special operations, I should remember your name. Marcus's fiancée has a loose definition of classified. She has a tight definition of inspiration. There aren't many female operators in our generation. Having proof that women were running special operations 30 years ago, that those women are still capable of extraordinary things. Riley's voice strengthened. That matters to those of us still fighting for recognition and respect. Margaret holstered her weapon. You want advice? Yes. Don't be me. Don't spend 30 years hiding who you are because it's classified or complicated or might make people uncomfortable. Be proud of your service. Be loud about your capabilities. And when people underestimate you because you're female or young or anything else, prove them so completely wrong that they can never make that mistake again. That's what you did. No, that's what I should have done. Margaret picked up her range bag. I hid. I stayed quiet. I let my service be classified and my accomplishments be anonymous because that's what the mission required. But the cost was that people like you didn't know women like me existed. That cost was too high. Riley pulled out her phone. Can I get your number? My unit is trying to develop better training protocols for female operators. Your experience would be invaluable. Margaret hesitated, then rattled off her number. I'm not promising anything, but I'll listen to what you need. That's all I'm asking. After Riley left, Margaret sat in her car in the parking lot and made a decision she'd been avoiding for 8 weeks. She pulled out her phone and called Admiral Hayes. Please tell me you're calling to say you're fully healed and enjoying retirement, Hayes answered. I'm calling to say I'm healed enough to have a conversation about what happens next. Hayes sighed. Maggie, we've been through this. You're retired. You're done. You've earned... I'm 58 years old, and I just ran the tactical course 9 seconds slower than my previous record. My shoulder has limited mobility. My leg aches when it rains. I am objectively less capable than I was 3 months ago. Margaret's voice was steady. But I'm still more capable than most active operators half my age, and I'm sitting here wondering what I'm supposed to do with that. You're supposed to enjoy your grandchildren and volunteer at the library and live the peaceful life you've earned. That's what everyone keeps saying. But Katie, I can't shake the feeling that walking away now means abandoning people who need help, that my experience and knowledge still have value even if my body is slower than it used to be. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. What are you proposing? I don't know yet, but I'm proposing we have a conversation about it. Margaret started her car. It started. You free for coffee tomorrow? I'm an admiral. I'm never free, but I'll make time. They met at a quiet cafe in Arlington, far from any military installations or government buildings. Hayes arrived in civilian clothes, jeans, and a sweater that made her look more like someone's aunt than a flag officer. Margaret had dressed similarly, both women instinctively avoiding anything that might draw attention. You look better, Hayes said, settling into the booth. Still moving carefully, but better. I feel 80 years old most mornings, but by afternoon I'm down to 60, so there's progress. Margaret ordered coffee, waited until the server left. I've been thinking about what happened. The operation, the rescue, all of it. Maggie, if this is guilt. It's not guilt, it's assessment. Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I ran that operation with insufficient intel, inadequate equipment, and minimal support. It succeeded because I had 3 decades of experience that let me improvise and adapt. But if I'd been a younger operator, even a more physically capable one, I'd have failed. The mission succeeded because of my age, not despite it. Hayes sipped her coffee. And that suggests that maybe we've been thinking about age and capability wrong. Maybe the military's focus on youth and physical performance is causing us to waste our most valuable asset, experienced operators who understand strategy and psychology and tactics at a level that can't be taught. That's a nice theory, but the reality is that combat requires physical capability. You nearly died on that operation. Your injuries required months of recovery. At some point, the physical limitations outweigh the mental advantages. Agreed, which is why I'm not proposing to run active operations. Margaret leaned forward. But what about training, consulting, strategic planning? There are dozens of ways experienced operators could contribute without being in the field. We have programs for that. Retired operators teach at various schools and facilities. And how many of those programs utilize female operators from classified special operations programs that officially didn't exist? Margaret held Hayes's gaze. How many young female soldiers know that women were running SEAL operations 30 years ago? How many understand that age and experience can compensate for physical limitations? Hayes set down her coffee. You want to come out of the shadows. I want to stop hiding. I want to acknowledge that my service happened, that it mattered, that it can still matter. Margaret's voice strengthened. I spent 30 years being invisible because the mission required it. But the mission is over, Katie. Victor is in prison. Hawk is recovered. The bioweapon is destroyed. There's no operational reason to keep hiding anymore. There are political reasons, bureaucratic reasons. The Pentagon doesn't want to admit that women were running special operations before the official policy change. Then the Pentagon needs to get over it, because right now every female soldier who wants to serve in special operations is reinventing the wheel, figuring out solutions we already discovered 30 years ago. That's inefficient and dangerous. Margaret finished her coffee. I'm not asking for medals or public recognition. I'm asking to be useful, to share what I learned so the next generation doesn't have to learn it the hard way. Hayes was quiet for a long time, processing the implications. If we do this, there will be pushback. Questions about why these operations were classified, who authorized them, what else the Navy has been hiding. Good. Let them ask questions. Maybe the answers will force some necessary conversations about how we've been handling special operations and gender integration. You're serious about this? I'm 58 years old and I just survived an operation that should have killed me. I don't have time to be anything but serious. Margaret met her friend's eyes. You asked me once what I wanted my legacy to be. I'm telling you now, I want it to be that I cleared a path for the women who come after me. I want them to know it's possible because I did it first. Hayes pulled out her phone, scrolled through her contacts, made a call. General Morrison, Catherine Hayes. I need a meeting about declassifying some operations from the 90s. Yes, I know it's complicated. That's why I'm calling you. She paused, listening. Tomorrow works. I'll bring supporting documentation. Another pause. And General, you're going to want to hear this. She hung up and looked at Margaret. This is going to take time. Months, maybe years. The bureaucracy moves slowly. I'm patient. I've been invisible for 30 years. I can wait a little longer to step into the light. 2 months later, Margaret stood in front of 40 female soldiers at Fort Bragg, all candidates for special operations training. They ranged from 19 to 35, representing every branch of service. Some looked confident. Others looked terrified. All of them looked skeptical when they saw their instructor, a gray-haired woman who looked more like a librarian than an operator. My name is Margaret Sullivan, she began. 30 years ago, I was Lieutenant Commander Margaret Chen, one of the first women to serve in Navy Special Operations before the policy officially changed. I ran classified missions in Somalia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. I've been shot 6 times, blown up twice, and declared KIA on 2 separate occasions. I'm 58 years old, I limp when it rains, and I need reading glasses to see the training materials. She paused, letting that sink in. I'm also the person who ran a hostage rescue operation 3 months ago that saved a captured SEAL and stopped a bioweapon attack. I did it with one other operator, insufficient equipment, and a body that's 58 years old. Margaret's voice hardened. So if anyone in this room thinks age means weakness, or that physical limitations mean you can't accomplish the mission, I'm here to prove you wrong. A hand went up. Young woman, early 20s, with the build of a distance runner. Ma'am, how did you compensate for physical limitations during the operation? By not trying to compensate. By accepting that I couldn't outrun or outfight younger opponents, so I had to outsmart them instead. Margaret pulled up satellite imagery on the projection screen. This was the target compound. 20 hostile combatants, fortified positions, advanced security. A younger operator would have tried a direct assault. I waited, observed patterns, identified weaknesses, and exploited their assumptions about what an older woman could do. Another hand. Weren't you scared? Terrified. Fear doesn't go away with experience. You just get better at functioning despite it. Margaret advanced to the next slide. The question isn't whether you feel fear. It's whether fear controls your decisions. On this operation, I used my fear as information. It told me when I was taking unnecessary risks, when I needed to slow down, when I was about to make a mistake. She spent the next 2 hours walking them through the operation, not the classified details, but the tactical decisions, the strategic thinking, the psychological calculations. She showed them how experience could compensate for physical limitations, how patience could overcome superior numbers, how understanding human psychology could create advantages that weapons couldn't. By the end, every soldier in that room was leaning forward, taking notes, asking questions. Final lesson, Margaret said as the session ended. Society will tell you that age makes you less valuable. The military will push you toward retirement when you hit 40 or 45. People will look at your gray hair or your reading glasses or your limp and assume you're past your prime. She met their eyes, each one in turn. Prove them wrong. Not by denying your limitations, but by showing that experience, wisdom, and determination matter more than youth and strength. Show them that the most dangerous operator isn't the youngest or fastest. It's the one they underestimate. Riley Garrett approached after the other soldiers had filed out. That was incredible. They're going to remember this session for years. They should remember it. Too many female operators wash out because they're trying to compete on physical terms with men who have biological advantages. If they learn to compete on strategic and psychological terms instead, their success rate will double. Margaret gathered her materials. Your mom would be proud of you, by the way. You asked good questions during the session. She wants to meet you. Says any woman who can run a hostage rescue at 58 is someone she needs to know. I'd like that. Comparing notes with another female veteran from our era might be therapeutic. 3 weeks after that, Margaret received a phone call from the Pentagon. A formal request to consult on special operations training protocols with particular focus on age-inclusive performance standards and experience-based tactical instruction. She said yes. 6 months after the operation, Margaret returned to Miller's tactical range one final time. She ran the tactical course again, curious to see how much her continued physical therapy had helped. 44 seconds. 3 seconds faster than her post-injury time, but still slower than her original record. She stood there weapon-safe, accepting what that meant. She would never be as physically capable as she'd been at 28 or even at 57 before the injuries. Her body had hit its peak and was now in gradual decline. But her mind was sharper than ever, her tactical thinking more refined, her understanding of psychology and strategy deeper than it had been 3 decades ago. Brad approached nervously. Ms. Sullivan, I wanted to apologize again for how I treated you when you first came here. I made assumptions based on what you could see, which is what most people do. Margaret smiled slightly. The lesson isn't that you were wrong to make assumptions. It's that you should be prepared to update those assumptions when evidence contradicts them. You did that. That's growth. Some of the other instructors don't believe the stories about you, about what you did, who you were. Let them doubt. I stopped needing validation from strangers a long time ago. Margaret picked up her range bag. But if they're curious, tell them the most dangerous weapon in any conflict isn't the biggest gun or the youngest soldier. It's the operator who's been underestimated their entire career and learned to use that underestimation as an advantage. She walked out to her car where Sarah was waiting with the grandchildren. Emma ran up immediately wearing a Captain America t-shirt. "Grandma, did you shoot stuff?" "I practiced my marksmanship, yes." "Was it awesome?" "It was adequate, which at 58 is about as good as I can hope for." Margaret ruffled her granddaughter's hair. "Ready to go home?" "Tyler wants to hear the story again, about how you saved your friend." Margaret glanced at Sarah, who nodded permission. They'd agreed that the children should know age-appropriate versions of the truth. No classified details, no graphic violence, but honest acknowledgement that Grandma had been a soldier and had done important things. "I'll tell the story on the drive home," Margaret said. As they drove, she recounted a simplified version. Bad people took her friend. She went to get him back. She had to be very brave and very smart because she wasn't as strong as the bad people. Emma listened with rapt attention. Tyler fell asleep halfway through, clutching his plastic shield. Sarah caught Margaret's eye in the rearview mirror. "You okay?" "I'm fine. Better than fine." Margaret watched the Virginia countryside pass by. "I spent 30 years hiding who I was. Now I get to share it with the people who matter most. That feels right." "The Pentagon consulting job, you're sure you want to do it?" "It's going to require travel, long hours, reliving things that might be painful." "I'm sure. Because every hour I spend training the next generation is an hour they spend learning from my mistakes instead of making their own. That matters more than my comfort." They pulled into Sarah's driveway. Tyler woke up as they were unloading immediately, asking to play superheroes in the backyard. Emma wanted Grandma to help with her homework, a school project about family history that suddenly had a lot more material to work with. Margaret settled at the kitchen table with Emma's poster board, carefully explaining the basics of her service without revealing anything classified. "So Grandma was in the Navy?" "Yes." "And you saved people?" "I tried to. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But I always tried." "Miss Patterson says that trying is what matters most." Emma carefully glued a picture of Margaret in her dress uniform, the only photo from her service years that wasn't classified. "Were you scared?" "Often. But being scared doesn't mean you stop trying. It just means you're smart enough to recognize danger." "I'm scared sometimes. At school when the big kids are mean." Margaret put down the glue stick and looked at her granddaughter seriously. "Being scared is okay. But don't let that fear stop you from standing up for yourself or for other people who need help. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you act despite the fear. Like you did when you saved your friend. Exactly like that." Emma finished gluing the photo, then looked up with 6-year-old directness. "When I grow up, I want to be brave like you." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "You already are, sweetheart. You already are." That evening, after Sarah drove her home, Margaret sat in her quiet apartment and opened her laptop. She'd been working on something for weeks, a detailed account of her service, the operations she'd run, the lessons she'd learned. Not for publication, not for recognition, but as a legacy document for her family and for the female operators who would come after her. She typed steadily, her shoulder aching but functional, her fingers finding the keys with practiced ease. The words came easier now than they had at first, the memories less painful when she knew they served a purpose. Around midnight, her phone buzzed. Text from Hawk. "Still awake. Unfortunately, you. Physical therapy kicked my ass today. Can't sleep. You free for a call?" She called him immediately. "How's recovery going?" "Slow but steady. Doctors say I'll make full recovery, but it'll take another 3 months minimum." Hawk's voice was tired but determined. "You. Consulting for the Pentagon on special operations training, teaching young female soldiers that age is an asset, not a liability. That's good. Important work. It's the work I should have been doing for the past 15 years instead of hiding in retirement." Margaret saved her document. "Hawk, do you ever regret it? The life we lived, the things we did. Every day, and never." He was quiet for a moment. "I regret the things I saw, the people I couldn't save, the toll it took on relationships and mental health. But I don't regret trying. Don't regret serving. Don't regret believing the mission mattered." even knowing the cost, especially knowing the cost, because if people like us don't pay that cost, it falls on people less prepared to handle it. We volunteered for this life. We chose it. That matters. Margaret thought about that after they hung up. Chose it. She'd been 19 when she joined the Navy, driven by her father's legacy and her own need to serve. She'd been 26 when she qualified for special operations, determined to prove women could handle the same missions as men. She'd been 38 when she ran the operation that killed Victor's father, certain that stopping a bioweapon attack justified any cost. Every choice had seemed necessary at the time. Every sacrifice had felt worthwhile. Every year of invisibility and secrecy had been in service of something larger than herself. But now, sitting in her quiet apartment at 58, she could finally ask whether it had been worth it. Whether the life she'd lived, the person she'd become, the legacy she was building, justified everything she'd given up. The answer came quickly, clearly, without doubt. Yes. Not because she'd been perfect or made all the right choices. Not because every mission succeeded or every sacrifice paid off, but because she'd tried. Because she'd stood up when others stayed silent. Because she'd proved that age and gender didn't determine capability, determination and experience did. The young instructors at the shooting range had looked at her and seen weakness. An old woman past her prime, incapable of anything beyond basic target practice. They'd been so certain of their assessment that they'd mocked her, openly, made jokes at her expense, dismissed her without a second thought. Then she'd shown them what underestimation cost. Margaret stood up, walked to her window, and looked out at the quiet street below. Somewhere in this country, young female soldiers were training for special operations, facing doubt and discrimination, wondering if they were capable enough, strong enough, good enough. She'd spent 30 years proving they were. Spent decades running missions that officially didn't exist to clear a path for women who didn't yet know they could walk it. Spent her life being invisible so others could be seen. That was her legacy, not the operations or the commendations or the classified service record that might never be fully declassified. But the knowledge that she'd opened doors challenged assumptions and proved that capability came in forms society didn't expect. She was 58 years old. She limped when it rained. She needed reading glasses and physical therapy and more recovery time than she used to. Her body was older, slower, more fragile than it had been. But her mind was sharper than ever. Her determination stronger. Her understanding of what truly mattered clearer than it had been at 28 or 38 or even 57. They'd looked at her and seen an old lady with a gun, something to mock and dismiss and underestimate. They'd sneered at the gray hair and the reading glasses and the sensible shoes, certain they knew exactly what she was capable of. They'd been wrong. Completely, utterly, dangerously wrong. And in those seconds after she'd loaded her weapon and destroyed their assumptions, everything had changed. Not just for them, but for every person who'd ever been underestimated because of age or gender or any other visible characteristic that hid their true capability. Margaret Sullivan, Lieutenant Commander. Margaret Chen, Navy SEAL, classified operator, grandmother, teacher, survivor, smiled at her reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back was scarred and gray and far from young, but she was also dangerous, capable, and absolutely done with being invisible. She'd spent 30 years in the shadows because the mission required it. Now the mission was different, to make sure no woman ever had to hide her capability again, to teach the next generation that experience was power, to prove that age was just another advantage when you understood how to use it. They'd sneered at the old lady with a gun, and in those seconds that followed, she'd changed everything, not just for herself, but for every person who would come after her, who would face the same doubts and dismissals and assumptions, who would need to know that someone had walked this path before them and survived and thrived and won. That was her truth. That was her legacy. That was who she was, and would always be the woman they underestimated right up until the moment she proved them catastrophically wrong.